You, Jackie, and good morning, everyone. It's such a great pleasure to be here with you this morning. Really excited about today's webinar. And although I'm a fun guy, Louise is going to be our expert today, and I have the great pleasure of introducing her. Louise is a longtime supporter and member and has been interested in wild mushrooms since she was a young child, but she became quite obsessed for the hobby in the last 20 years. Louise says it's fun to learn new species and to be on the lookout for mushroom sightings while out and about in the great outdoors. Mushrooms are not only incredibly photogenic, but are also a fascinating and important part of our environment. In addition to hunting for mushrooms, Louise also leads hikes for the Bruce Trail Conservancy and snowshoe outings for the Five Winds Backcountry Ski Club. So you're in for a treat, Louise. Thank you so much for your time today, and over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. And welcome everyone to this lecture. I must say I'm always pleasantly surprised how much interest these kind of lectures generate. I think sometimes when I'm hiking with friends or I'm with my husband, I just go on and on about mushrooms and their eyes start to glaze over. So it's not a passion that everyone shares, but obviously you do. So I'm really happy that you've decided to join us today. Here. And I do want to start the lecture by just reminding people I'm not an expert. I'm not a mycologist. I didn't go to university and study mushrooms. I studied veterinary medicine, actually. So this is just my hobby. And please take everything I say with a grain of salt. And also, you know, if you're doing any reading on the internet, very much so. I do want to remind people too that if you are thinking of foraging, that it is illegal to forage in provincial parks and in conservation areas. It's also obviously illegal to forage on private property. And the Bruce Trail has asked that we not forage on the trail. And that's, I think, for a variety of reasons. I'm just going to speculate about that, but I think it's common sense that if we pick them, then other people can admire them. And also, there's a concern with commercial foragers, especially that, you know, if they're tromping around, they're stomping on things and they're damaging the surrounding environment. So you may or may not know that actually picking a mushroom doesn't kill it. It's like an apple on an apple tree. It grows from the tree, which are the mycelium, and I'll get into that a little bit more when we get into mushroom anatomy, but you're not killing the mushroom by picking it. But having said that, we still want to make sure that we leave them on the trail so that other people can admire them as well. So in today's lecture, we're going to talk about mushroom anatomy. I think it's really important when you're wanting to identify mushrooms that you know what to look at. And then I'm going to touch very briefly on how to photograph mushrooms. We're going to go into mushroom families, and I'll give some examples from some of the more common families. I'm going to spend a bit of time on poisonous mushrooms. I think it's really important to learn the poisonous ones first for obvious reasons, especially if you are interested in foraging on non-legal locations. And then I'm not really going to go a lot into edible mushrooms, but I do have one slide that just sort of shows an example of some of them. So we'll start with mushroom anatomy. Your sort of classical mushroom would look like this picture here on the left. Most mushrooms, but not all mushrooms, have a cap, and then they have a structure under the cap that the spores come out of. So the spores are kind of like the baby mushrooms. So you want to just take note of that. Some mushrooms have a ring, also called an annulus. Some have a stalk, also called a stipe. Not all of them will have a bulb or a cup or vulva, sorry. And some of them are sort of, let me back up a bit. So some of them are kind of bulbous at the bottom. Some of them have a vulva and cup, mainly in the Amanita family, and I'll give some examples of that later. Some mushrooms, not many, have a taproot, and they all come from mycelia, which are kind of like little threads in the ground. And I don't know if I have any Star Trek fans in the audience or not, but you may be interested to know, if you're not a Trekkie, that the writers of the show came up with a character called Stamets, who's based on this very famous guy here. So this is Paul Stamets. He's a very famous mycologist. He lives in the Western USA. And he's been featured in a recent YouTube, not YouTube, I'm sorry, Netflix documentary on mushrooms. And in the Star Trek series, I don't get them, I don't subscribe to Crave TV, but anyway, this character Stamets is their chief scientist, and he's designed a mycelial drive that the spaceship travels through space on. So kind of a creative storyline. And again, I think it just goes to show the popularity of mushrooms, and especially of Paul Stamets. So when you're wanting to identify mushroom, you want to look at a bunch of different structures. So first of all, the cap, which is the top part of the mushrooms, and you want to look at the shape and the color and the texture. Like some of them are smooth, some of them are slimy, some of them might have little scales on them, some of them might have freckles, like the Super Mario mushroom, you know, that red one with the red polka dots on it. So these are all identifying features. You want to look to see if it does have a ring. This is really important because a lot of the really deadly poisonous mushrooms do have a ring, also called an annulus. And some of them are really, really obvious, and some of them are just like a little remnant. You want to look at the stem. Is it smooth, or does it have some texture? Is it sort of all like the same width the whole length, or does it get fatter at the bottom? Does it get skinnier at the bottom? The color, obviously. And also, does it change color when you touch it? They call that bruising. So some mushrooms will turn blue when you bruise them, and that would be an identifying feature. We want to see if they have a vulva, and this is where, you know, if you're just passing by and looking at them and not picking them, you're not going to be able to do that. But if you were in areas where you're allowed to dig up mushrooms, you want to make sure that you do go pretty deep, because if you miss that it has a cup, it could be a poisonous mushroom and you wouldn't even know it. So it's just really important that if you're identifying mushrooms, that you do that. And then when you're looking at the underside of the cap, does it have gills, or does it have other structures that disseminate the spores, such as pores, and they look like little holes or teeth? And then one fun thing to do is to make a spore print. And this is kind of a fun project with kids sometimes. So you would pick a mushroom, you know, maybe if there's some in your backyard, you could pick them, and then you put them on a piece of, here they're showing white paper, but if it has a white spore print, that's not going to work. So aluminum foil will probably be the best thing to put it on. And then you put a glass over top of it, so the glass is upside down, and then you leave it for 12 to 24 hours. And afterwards you have a look, is it a black spore print or a pink spore print or a white spore print? And then you can go to your mushroom books, and that just becomes another clue for identification. And when you're photographing mushrooms, so there are Facebook groups that you can join. I'll give you some links to that later, where you can take a picture of a mushroom and you can upload it to this Facebook group, and then people will chime in and tell you what it is. And that is an amazing learning tool. The problem though is if you were to just give them this picture, and that's pretty well useless. There's so many mushrooms that look like that have this brown cap. You're not going to get an ID. So you want to actually submit a picture from the side, from the top, from the bottom, cut it in half and submit a cross section, because they want to see how the gills attach to the stem. If it's a bolete, and we'll go into that family later, does it change color when you scrape the underside of the cap with your fingernail or with a knife? Smell it, and also note where it's growing from. And on this topic, a lot of people are afraid to touch mushrooms, like poisonous mushrooms. They think if they touch it, they're going to die. And that is not the case at all. You can touch poisonous mushrooms. It's a dose-related poisoning, so you're not going to get enough of a dose just touching it. Don't worry about that. And same with smelling them. You're not going to die if you smell a poisonous mushroom. And the reason it's important to note the habitat is that a lot of mushrooms have a relationship with trees. So if you find a mushroom that's growing on a tree or under a tree, but you didn't note what kind of tree it was, when you post those pictures on that Facebook group, or you email it to, a friend who knows a lot about mushrooms, they're not going to be able to help you because they really need to have as many clues as possible. So just take note of that. It's really important. And also, like, is it growing from the soil or from a rotting log, that kind of thing. Okay, I'm just going to touch very briefly on photography. I'm not a photographer, but here are a few tips on how to take good pictures of mushrooms. So one of them is you don't want what I sort of call the cap shot, or taking a view just looking straight down on a mushroom. All you're going to see is the cap, and it's kind of boring, right? If you look at this picture as compared to this picture. So here the photographer got down at the mushroom's level and took a picture from lying down, or just putting the camera down on the ground. And because we have to worry about ticks and we don't want to get dirty, it's a good idea to put, bring a big garbage bag. Doesn't weigh very much. You can keep that in your pack. And then you can lie down on that garbage bag and you're not going to get dirty. And if you don't want your camera to get wet, if it's, a rainy day, you could have a little grocery bag or something and put your camera on that. And then obviously you're going to want to get pretty close. Make sure it's in focus. And if you're in an area where you can't pick it and photograph it that way, what you can do is you can put your camera in selfie mode and then just stick the camera underneath the mushroom and you should be able to take a picture of the gills. It's not going to be the best photograph, but it's better than nothing. Obviously, we want good lighting. We don't want a shaky camera. And then finally, if you want your picture to look really pretty, you can frame it. And that's what this is showing here, is that, they've got some leaves around it. And professional photographers will actually pick, like move the leaves, or they'll place this little twig here, right? They might actually place that in the frame just to make it look extra interesting. If you are interested in some more information, here are a couple of sources of where I got this information from. You can just go online and check that out. Okay, so when I'm trying to figure out what a mushroom is, I like to sort of keep things simple and kind of dumb it down for myself. So I try to sort of think of mushrooms as being in a certain family. So I'm going to say, which of these families would it fit in? And then from there, I can sort of try to determine what it is. And, you have different mushroom textbooks, and I'll give you some suggestions at the end of the lecture. Some of them will break them down this way. Some of them will actually break them down by spore print. Like you can't go into that book and look up mushrooms unless you do have the spore print information. But anyway, this is the way I do it. I break it down into families. So an example, most of the mushrooms that we think of as your sort of textbook mushroom, or what people call toadstools, would have gills, but not all mushrooms have gills. So for example, the bolete family has tubes, and some have pores, some have teeth, and then some of them are just like these really funky shaped things. This is an earth star, which would be loosely in the puffball family. Some of them form little cups. By the way, this time of year, you're going to see a lot of scarlet cups, these bright red mushrooms that are in the leaf litter that look like a cup. Kind of exciting, one of our first spring mushrooms. I saw some not that long ago on the Bruce Trail. They're really, really pretty. But anyway, they fit in that family. So I'm going to start with the Polypore family. This is a pretty common family, and then it's a really cool family too that you're going to see at all times of year. So, you're going to see them in the winter as well as in the spring, summer, and fall. And you're going to note that they don't have gills, they have pores. So poly in Latin means, many, and pore. They're normally forming shelf-like structures, and they're usually found on trees. And this picture here kind of shows, I hope you can see that there's like little tiny holes on the bottom. Those would be the pores. This one here, turkey tail, is one of my very favorite polypores. It's just such a beautiful mushroom. Comes in a variety of colors, and it's also medicinal. And I'm going to point out, I'm going to use common names a lot in this lecture just to keep things simple, but it's more, not important, but you've got to be careful with common names, because in some countries, they might use a common name that's not the common name in North America, and then you get a mistake in your identification. So if you're a purist, you're going to use the scientific names. So turkey tail, for example, would be Trametes versicolor. And one thing I find frustrating as a hobbyist is that the mycologists are changing the Latin names all the time. And that's because right now they're doing a lot of DNA testing on mushrooms. So they're able to say, wow, we thought that this mushroom was in this family, but actually we were wrong. Our DNA testing is showing it's actually more closely related to this mushroom. And that's why they're changing the names. So I'm kind of waiting for all that to settle down. Eventually they'll hopefully stop changing the names, and then it'll be a little easier to memorize all these Latin names. So back to turkey tail. Turkey tail is medicinal. They've actually done double-blinded clinical trials. I'll explain that in a minute, but they've shown that for cancer therapy, that turkey tail helps improve people's response to chemotherapy. It helps stimulate the immune system. And it's just kind of the way I think of it is it's like the immune system saying, oh, cancer cell, I didn't see you before, but now I do. And I don't like you at all. So I am going to kill you. And it doesn't do it alone. So it's not like, it's a replacement for chemotherapy based on the reading I've done. It's just more, it helps extend duration of life in response to treatments. So that's really exciting. And what a double-blinded study is, and this is really important because I think people read stuff on the internet and then they take it at face value. But a double-blinded study would be where the scientist breaks people into two groups, and then there's a placebo group, and then there's a group that's getting the real medicine, and the participants in the study don't know what they're taking, so they're blinded. But then more importantly, the scientist is blinded as well, because there's going to be bias in a study that you really want your hypothesis to be correct, and maybe subconsciously you're going to skew the results. But if you're blinded as well and you don't know who's in what group until the very end of the study, that's not going to influence the results. So when we're reading about medicine or a whole bunch of things, right? Ideally, you're looking at a double-blinded study, and then that is statistically significant. So sorry, I've just kind of segued a little bit about this because I just find this stuff really interesting. The other thing I want to mention, I was hiking with a friend recently. He's probably listening to this, and he was going on about chaga, and he had bought some chaga, and thought this was really great. And we can buy some of these medicinal mushrooms in health food stores or at trade shows and stuff. And you have to be really careful because, are you really sure that what you're buying is what the person is claiming? Like, there's a lot of money to be made in this. And there's a really neat guy. He's going to be in my reference list, called Adam Harridan. And he actually talks in one of his YouTube videos about someone did a study and they went to health food stores and they got samples of, mushrooms that were being sold for medicine. And then they did DNA analysis on these products, and they found not only were they not what the label claimed, but there were traces of poisonous mushrooms in some of these things that were being sold. Probably not enough to kill people, but it's a little alarming that, they're hiring someone to go and pick these mushrooms in the wild and then putting them in capsules. And the person that's foraging them doesn't even know what they're doing. And they're actually selling them poisonous mushrooms to put in their concoction. So you just need to be really, really careful. This is one of sort of my bees in my bonnets about health food products. People think something's natural, it's got to be better than a pharmaceutical product, but there's really no regulation in that industry, and it's buyer beware. Okay, so these are, back to the lecture, these are some other examples of polypore. This is a birch polypore, named that because it grows on birch trees. And this is a tinder polypore. It also grows on birch trees. Is often mistaken for chaga because as it gets rotten, it turns like this black lumpy thing. But when it's fresh, it looks like a horse hoof. So it's called a tinder polypore or a horse hoof polypore. And it can be used for tinder. So what's kind of cool is that, in prehistoric times or in simple times when people had to make their own fire, they would put an ember in this fungus, and then it would sort of smolder for hours and hours, and they could carry their fire from one place to another. And if you've heard of, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Otzi, who was the Iceman or the mummy that they found in the glacier, he had both of these mushrooms on him. And the speculation is that he was using the tinder polypore to carry his fire around, and the birch polypore because it's medicinal. So it has immune stimulating properties as well. And also the surface of the cap, you can peel like it off as a little layer and it'll make like a makeshift band-aid. That's kind of cool about that species of mushroom. This polypore you're going to start seeing soon. It tends to flush in the spring. So flushing means that's when they start popping out. So it's a common spring mushroom. It's nicknamed a dryad salad because a dryad was kind of like a fairy. And so, you know, I guess someone had a great imagination and they could picture that on this beautiful little shelf, you'd have a little fairy in the woods that'd be watching you as you went by. And it's also called a pheasant back because if you use your imagination, the surface looks like bird feathers. And one identifying feature of this mushroom is it smells like watermelon rind. It is an edible mushroom, by the way, and it's a beginner mushroom because there's no lookalikes. So the chance of poisoning yourself would be very low. But by the way, it doesn't taste very good. And then this is another edible mushroom that's a polypore called a chicken of the woods. And it's just this beautiful bright orange on the top, and then the pores are a really bright yellow. And it's called chicken of the woods because it has a very high protein content. And if you use your imagination when you cook it up and eat it, it kind of tastes like chicken. So foragers really like this mushroom a lot. It is quite allergenic, so some people will react to mushrooms and have and get quite sick, like really bad tummy ailments primarily, or some people can break out in hives. So one of the things I learned when I started foraging is that when you pick a mushroom to eat and it's your first time, you only eat like a teaspoon or less, and then you wait 24 hours to see if you're going to be allergic to it or if it causes tummy upsets in you. So this is one of these ones that's, and some varieties of mushrooms are way more likely to cause allergic reactions than others. This would be one. Okay, the next family of mushrooms are the bolete family, and they have tubes. Can you see this? Instead of gills, so that's where the little spores will come out. And I find that a lot of them have caps where you think it's going to be a gilled mushroom, but then when you go look underneath, it's like, surprise, surprise, it's not, it's a bolete. And they usually grow on the ground. They don't grow from trees. One of the most common and well-known ones is the one called the king bolete, and it has a whole bunch of common names. So like in England, they call it a penny bun, and kind of looks like a hamburger bun, right? And one of the identifying features is it has this white reticulation. So it's like a white netting on the mushroom. There is a lookalike that is very common in our area called Telophilus spilus, or the bitter bolete. And it has a similar colored cap, but instead of having white reticulation, it has brown reticulation. And this mushroom, the pores tend to be when it's fresh white and yellowish when it's older, versus the bitter bolete, the pores are almost like lilac-y kind of color. And it's called the bitter bolete because if you were to cook it up and put it in a recipe, it's like horrifically bitter. This mushroom has a really nutty flavor. Not really common in our area, more common up north. These are a kind of a fun bolete. They're called a painted bolete, and they're common up in the Canadian Shield area. So if if you have cottage in the Muskokas, you're going to see a lot of these. And they have this kind of cool covering of the gill structure when they're young, and then when they open up, the pores are kind of a yellowish color. And this one's a granulated bolete. I have seen a lot of it in southwestern Ontario, tends to like growing under pine trees. It has this kind of really sticky cap, and then the pores are this yellow color, which is sort of very common to this entire Suilus family. And both of these are edible mushrooms. This picture is just to remind us and me that there are actually hundreds of type of boletes, and they're fun because they come in so many colors. So, some of them will have red pores, and some of them will have yellow pores, and some of them will steam blue, and a whole variety of colors. If you're really, and some of them have like these little dots on the stem, right? They're nicknamed scabber stalks because they look like little black scabs, I guess, or blackheads. If you're really keen on it, there's this really neat web page called the Bolete Filter, where you can key it out, and they have over 300 varieties in that filter. So you put in what region you're from, and just the characteristics of the cap and the pores and the stem, and it'll help you with your identification. So that's all called keying out a mushroom. An old-fashioned key would be like, this big paper list, and you go number 1, is it this color? Yes or no. Go to number 2, and then if it's yes or no, you would go to number 5. Very, very time consuming and kind of frustrating to key out a mushroom that way. So I really like this webpage. It just really helps you key out the Bolete family. It's really hard to do. So the next group would be the puffball family. I think most of us are familiar with giant puffballs. They do have a cousin called the pear-shaped puffball that's quite small. Giant puffballs usually grow from the ground, and the little pear-shaped puffballs are usually growing from stumps or dead logs. And with puffballs, when you cut them in half, they should be pure white in the middle. So the risk with a puffball is that some of the poisonous mushrooms, amanitas, will look like a puffball when they're really young, but when you cut them in half, you're going to see a baby mushroom growing from inside. It's not going to be pure white. This is something that is often mistaken for a puffball. So it's an earth ball. It's also called, oh, I'm just having a brain fart. Anyway, it is a poisonous mushroom, and it's black in the middle. It's not pure white. I talked about the scarlet cups that we're seeing this time of year, and you're going to be seeing a lot more of them soon. So, they're this really pretty scarlet color. And then we have orange peel fungus as well. And then these are stinkhorns. I've never seen one. So I've just seen pictures of them, and they come in a variety of colors, and even this funky shape here. And they're apparently aptly named, so apparently they stink. And that's one of their identifying features. And then this is an earth star. They're not really common. They tend to come out more in the fall. But keep your eye open for them because they're really unique and really pretty. Oh, and by the way, this little hole is where the the spores would come out. Whereas with the cups, where their little spores come out is on that part of the surface. And obviously the puffballs, they're all in the middle. So the next family would be the morel family. This would be your classical morel. There is a lookalike called the false morel. So these are true morels and these are false morels. And some of the species of false morels have a type of chemical in them that is a lot like jet fuel. So if you were to make a mistake and cook this up, thinking that it was a real morel, and you inhale those fumes, you can cause serious damage to your liver. So there is a little caution with that family. I thought this was funny, obviously photoshopped. So the next family is the type of mushrooms that have veins, so the Chanterelle families. There's some really popular wild edibles in there. So these are the golden chanterelles, one of the more highly prized gourmet mushrooms. And these are black trumpets. And black trumpets would be what I would call a beginner mushrooms. There are no poisonous lookalikes, and they have a very unique aroma as well. Not really common in southwestern Ontario, very common in the Muskoka area. And these are chanterelles. So in our area, chanterelles will usually flush in July. Up north, they tend to have a longer season where they might be from July all the way through to the late fall. You might find them. And they have a relationship with trees. So they do like oak trees, and so do black trumpets. And black trumpets are my favorite edible. Okay, so we're next going to talk about the gills family. And I just want to remind you that when you're looking at the gills, that you want to sort of look at this kind of detail. Are they attached to the stem or are they free? If they are attached to the stem, do they go down the stem part of the way, or do they kind of like notch upwards? These are all identifying features that are important to take note of. So when we're in the gilled family, you can sort of break them into subcategories. So there are some, the russulas and the lacteris. These are milky mushrooms. I'll talk a little bit more about those, but they don't have a ring and they're really brittle. So when you pick them and you can sort of snap the stem like a piece of chalk. Most mushrooms are really friable and they're just going to disintegrate, but these ones have a really brittle stem and brittle gills. So they're nicknamed brittle gills, actually. You're going to maybe have some that have a ring, and if they do, you want to make sure that they don't have a cup. So those would be our grocery store mushrooms. You know, the button mushrooms would fall into that family. Some of them have a cup, some of them have a web. I'm going to show some examples of them. Some of them are milky, and then there's sort of like this miscellaneous category where they have broad caps. So these are the brittle gills. They come in a variety of colors. They're really, really beautiful. They tend to come out in this area more sort of in the late summer. These are really common. So a lot of you will go, yeah, I've seen those. I haven't seen too many of these or the yellow ones. And there's a lot of these like plain white colored ones, more common up in the Muskoka area and the Canadian Shield. And these ones are just as common as dirt. And these mushrooms, if they're parasitized by another mushroom, turn a bright orange color and become what's referred to as a lobster mushroom. So this is not edible, but when it's parasitized and becomes a lobster mushroom, it is. Isn't that weird? Very weird. We have also the milky caps. So they kind of look like brittle gills, right? Like if you kind of look at this guy here, and then this guy here, they look exactly the same, but this one, if you look carefully, is oozing these little droplets referred to as milk. So when you run your fingers along the gills, this milk will ooze out. And the milk can be a whole bunch of different colors depending on the variety. So, right, some of these will have this bright blue milk. This is an indigo milky. Isn't it beautiful? Not super common, likes pines, but it does occur on the Goose Trail in places. And this one's an orange milky. So it's really fun, like this whole family. And some of them even smell like coconut. This would be the agaricus family and a lot of its cousins. So they have a ring on the stem, but they don't have a cup. So I'm just sort of showing, you know, your grocery store mushrooms. So these are the button mushrooms and our portobello mushrooms. These would be the wild variety that grow in fields. Some of them some of these are poisonous. They're called yellow stainers. And if you were to consume these, you would get wicked vomiting and diarrhea. So they're, you know, they're not necessarily a safe mushroom to forage. And these are called honey mushrooms. They're related to shiitake mushrooms, very highly prized by foragers, especially people from Eastern Europe. They like to pickle them, and they have all sorts of cool recipes for them. They're kind of a fun mushroom. There are poisonous lookalikes for honey mushrooms. Oh, and they're probably called honey mushrooms because they have kind of like this honey color. So this is the Amanita family, kind of a really gorgeous family, but also scary because there are a lot of poisonous mushrooms in this family. So the identifying feature, right, is that a lot of them have an annulus, and then they grow from this cup or the vulva. This is another type of gilled mushroom called Cortinarius, and because they have a cortina, so the cortina is this web-like structure that would normally have covered the gills when it was just starting to pop out, and then it breaks and you have all these little filamentous threads. They usually have brown spore prints, so you can kind of see that it's brown, and the cortina here is turning brown. And most of the mushrooms in this family are poisonous. So, you know, it's really important to look for this web-like structure when you're looking at gills. And these are sort of miscellaneous ones that fit in the family. So, you know, we have parasols and false parasols. These ones are on the bottom very poisonous. They have a green spore print, whereas the real parasols have a different color spore print. And these are bluets. They're kind of pretty. They're almost a lilac color. Bluets tend to flush in the fall. And then we have a variety of poisonous mushrooms. And there's really a handful of them. So it's not really hard to memorize them. And I really encourage people to do that. Start, you know, if you're really keen on learning mushrooms, start with the poisonous mushrooms. So we've probably all heard of the destroying angel and seen it, the death cap. I'm not going to go into a lot of these in detail. I encourage you to do your own reading and research on them. I will talk about some of the more common ones, the death cap. Not as common here in the east as it is on the west coast. The false death cap is more common here. The characteristics of both of these is that they have sort of a greenish tinge to the cap. And of course, you know, they have the annulus and the vulva. These are really common in Southwest Ontario. They tend to come out in the early fall. They're pure white. They're called a destroying angel. An angel probably because they're so beautiful and, you know, white. Both of these, though, if you were to accidentally consume them, would just totally destroy your liver. Signs of poisoning initially would be severe gastrointestinal distress, so vomiting, diarrhea, and apparently from the reading I've done, you know, people, that phase will pass and they're like, whew, I'm okay and I'm feeling better. And then, you know, 3 or 4 days later, you're in liver failure, often irreversible. So pretty scary mushrooms. These are other poisonous mushrooms in the Amanita family. These are nicknamed fly agaric. The red varieties are more common on the west coast, and the yellowish variety are more common in our area. And then this one is a panther cap. And they have a different toxin than the one that's found in the previous family, right? So the toxin in here is called an amatoxin. These ones have ibotenic acid and muscimol, and so does the panther cap. And just a little reminder, right? Like, isn't this a lot prettier of a picture than this one? So this is the kind of photograph when you're taking a picture of a mushroom that you want to go for. These are very, very common poisonous mushrooms called Galerina. And some of the identifying features of that would be the cap is brown, but so are the gills. And then they have this little remnant here of an annulus or a ring. It's sort of, you can see it there. And sometimes all you see is you just see like a little bit of brown coloring on the stem. You don't even see that ring at all. And they're really terrifying because, you know, they look to me, right? They look a lot like honey mushrooms, and they can all grow on the same log. So I've heard stories of people foraging honey mushrooms and they, you know, they're just picking all these mushrooms. They accidentally pick one of these. They don't notice they're in there. They cook them up. And these are so poisonous that even one little tiny mushroom like this will kill you. So yeah, definitely want to learn that. And then I mentioned that the web caps are poisonous. These are called fiber caps. They're really fibrous, hence the name. And then we talked about the false parasol being poisonous as well. You can see here this greenish color to the gills. For people that have heard of chanterelles and have seen them, it does have a poisonous look-alike called the jack-o'-lantern. Jack-o'-lanterns normally will grow on decaying wood. The problem is sometimes that wood is buried, so you think it's growing out of the ground, but it's not. There's some wood underneath the ground. What makes it different than chanterelles, chanterelles have like veins, so if you were try to scrape them off with your fingernail, they're a little harder to scrape off. And jack-o'-lanterns have true gills, and they're more knife-like than looking like a vein. And there's a little bit of a color difference. So a jack-o'-lantern would be a bright orange. A chanterelle is more like a golden yellow. And these guys are kind of cool because they glow in the dark. So I've never seen that personally, but I guess if you find some and then you go back in the dark, they might glow kind of a greenish color. And then I'm just sort of showing sulfur tufts, which are poisonous and are often mistaken for brick tops, which are an edible mushroom, slightly different color. This is where doing spore prints is really handy. And definitely brick tops would not be a beginner mushroom. And then one of my final slides is just to show that, yep, there are lots of edible mushrooms out there if you're interested in that. I always encourage people to go out on a foray with people who know their stuff. So there is a club called the MST, the Mycological Society of Toronto, and they lead forays where, you know, there's really experienced people that go out and then they point out mushrooms to you and they help you identify your mushrooms. But these would be some of the more common edible ones that we find in our area. Some of them are really easy to identify, like these called bear's head. They kind of look like icicles hanging down. And we talked about the chicken of the woods being, really distinct. Coral fungus, some of them are edible, some of them are not. This guy's cool. This is hen of the woods. Kind of looks like a bunch of feathers. Honey mushrooms I talked about, and the cautions, how they can be mistaken for other ones. Morels are not always easy to identify. So yeah, it's kind of fun. Okay, so into resources, these are some of the books that I have that help with identification. And because this is an addiction, right? So are the books. But the ones I would recommend for beginners would be George Barron's book, So Mushrooms of Ontario and Eastern Canada. He is a mycologist who used to teach at the University of Guelph. And then I really like this one called Mushrooms of the Northeast. It's a lot smaller and it really makes things simple. And then Aurora's book is really fun. He's really funny, but this is a really heavy duty book for sort of people who are really serious about mushrooms. And then Baroni's really nice. This is a newer textbook. He's got a lot of really beautiful color plates in here, and he sort of makes it a little more simpler as well. And then web pages. So these are all links. I'm going to be sending, well, Megan already has this PowerPoint presentation. So I'm assuming that if you're interested, you can contact her and she can provide you with this in a PDF format, where if you click on these links, they'll open up for you. This is one of my favorites. This is YouTube, and this particular fellow's name is Adam. He's very knowledgeable. He's a scientist. He's just not someone who does it as a hobby like I am. And his videos are very detailed, very accurate, and also very entertaining. So very enjoyable. This is something that was put out by the City of Toronto, and it's actually pretty comprehensive. So it's a web page that's really good. And then I'll just put a couple of other web pages here. There's also some really amazing Facebook groups. So these are some of my favorites, and the MST has one as well. I do want to caution, though, that there are people that go on Facebook and they're called trolls, where they'll give you the wrong ID. So you'll put a picture up and they'll go, yeah, that one's edible, go for it. And it's not. They must think it's funny. It's not funny at all, right? I mean, it's pretty horrific. But what you want to do, what I recommend you do, is if you join one of these groups, is become a lurker at the beginning and just sort of keep an eye for who is giving accurate IDs. And after a while, you'll get to recognize the people who know their stuff and the people who don't. But we really have to be careful about trolls. And we're lucky in these ID groups. There are some mycologists that do participate in their groups. And that's kind of really, really fun. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So I think we'll just open up to question and answer.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Louise. I learned so much in the last through your presentation, and absolutely have a healthy respect for mushrooms. And so thanks for sharing your knowledge. So far, there are two questions that have come in, and the first one says, "I like your puns." I know you had them sprinkled throughout, so that's a comment of kindness from Peggy. And then the next question, which you touched on, do poisonous mushrooms kill you or just make you sick?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends on the type of mushroom and the dose. I'm just going to go back a few slides. Okay, so for example, this one wouldn't kill you, but it would make you have severe vomiting and diarrhea, and you might have to be hospitalized. Sometimes they're that severe. Same with jack-o'-lantern, like apparently severe gastrointestinal distress. It's not going to kill you dead. You're just going to wish you were dead. And then, we talked about Galerina, that will kill you dead. This little tiny guy would. And with this one, it's all dose related. So probably a part of that cap would kill you. It would depend on your body weight too. So with poisons, you have something called an LD50. That's the lethal dose required to kill 50% of the subjects. And you can look that up for a bunch of different poisons, but some mushrooms would have a lower LD50 and some would have a higher LD50. It's just recommended, obviously, that you you just wouldn't consume any of that. And even these guys, by the way, that wouldn't kill you dead, can make you pretty sick. So, the fly agaric, and by the way, it was called a fly agaric because they would mix these mushrooms with milk and use them to poison flies. So this mushroom causes heart palpitations and vomiting and profuse salivation and hallucination is one of the things that it'll do. Wouldn't kill you, but it would be pretty severe. Yeah, good question.
Okay, thank you. Suzanne asks, can you please talk about lion's mane?
Lion's mane. Yeah, what does Suzanne want to know? So maybe she wants to know the medicinal properties. I'm just going to go back to the slide where I showed it. So she's talking about a mushroom that's closely related to bear's head. So it has like these icicle-like things. They grow on dead and dying wood. And they've been reported, and there are scientific studies going on to have medicinal effects. They stimulate regeneration of nerve, and there's a lot of promise for people with Alzheimer's and possibly people with spinal cord damage, and maybe this would help stimulate regeneration of nerves. So that's kind of really exciting. And I've heard that they are sold in farmers markets for that, and yeah, they can be grown. So a lot of mushrooms, by the way, a lot of wild mushrooms cannot be grown commercially. They're very difficult to grow that way. So a chanterelle would be an example, or a morel. Others are really easy to grow, like oyster mushrooms. You can buy them in the grocery store. And bear's head mushrooms or lion's mane can be grown commercially, and some people are doing that, and then they're selling it. So it's kind of an exciting type of mushroom. Oh, and it tastes like crab. Crazy that if you were to forage it and fry it up in a bit of butter, it will taste like crab. It does. The first time I ever ate it, I got wicked diarrhea. So it's one of those that you have to cook really well. You have to cook honey mushrooms really well too. They're really prone to giving people severe tummy aches. And morels, even though they're a prized gourmet mushroom, if they're raw, they're poisonous. They have to be cooked well. So I had that experience too, where I undercooked one, and I had an unsettled stomach for a couple hours after I ate that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I've got a comment from Margaret Odell that says, thanks for an excellent presentation. Slowly getting this. Cheers. And then a question from Richard saying, during a walk in the woods last September, we came across a line of mushrooms 50 meters or more. Was this one long mushroom or a series of individuals?
Yeah, well, that would probably be a series of individuals. Remember how we talked about the mycelium, right? So you've got all that mycelium underground, and some mushrooms will grow in fairy rings, which is kind of cool, right? Where they start to spread, and then all of a sudden you've got this big ring, if you use your imagination, of mushrooms, or they just may be all in a big group. And that's because, maybe it started as one or two, and they dropped their spores, and then they started growing, and all of a sudden you've got this mycelium going. And on the topic of mycelium, the honey mushroom is known to have mycelial networks that are sometimes like hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And so that's one thing that Paul Stamets is famous for, is he kind of made us aware that the honey mushroom has this mycelial network that is massive, and trees will communicate using mycelium. So that's really, really exciting. And we talked during Michael's intro, he talked about the environmental importance of mushrooms. So not only that trees and plants can communicate with each other, which is just flabbergasting, right? But also mushrooms are really important to help break down decaying debris. So if we didn't have mushrooms, plants wouldn't break down, we wouldn't have fertilizer in the ground, we wouldn't have food, we wouldn't have plants growing, trees growing. So they're really exciting that way. And they're also really exciting that, a lot of organizations are looking at them as an alternative to plastic. So, they're coming out with furniture that's made out of fungi. Instead of having those awful styrofoam peanuts, some companies are having mushroom-based products instead that are really biodegradable. And some mushrooms can actually remove toxins from the environment. So, some researchers are looking into that. And Paul Stamets has been very involved in that kind of research. And he's also been involved in mushroom research where they're using mushrooms to help treat a lot of bee-related diseases as well, helping the honeybees.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I know I'm a huge fan of Star Trek, and I didn't know that connection with Stamets and the Mycelium Network, so that's fantastic too.
I
That
only
you're
knew
getting.
because my brother and my sister-in-law are huge Trekkies, so they actually told me.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
We've got a question here from David. Are there some types of species we are more certain to see in certain parts of the Bruce Trail? For example, southern sections versus the north.
Yeah, there definitely are. And most of the ones that I've sort of given as examples would be ones that we are likely to see in southwestern Ontario. If I mention the Muskokas, then those would be ones that were less common. But yeah, so for example, honey mushrooms, they come out in usually early September and in the fall, common as dirt, and you'll find them in massive clusters. So I've seen these in the peninsula section really commonly, but even in the Cambridge area, they're really common. Morels, of course, pop up everywhere, and they're kind of like, don't tell anyone if you saw one, right? Or I'll have to kill you. Like they're so they're not rare, but they're just hard to find, right? So people really generally don't want to tell you when they've seen them. But I've seen them on the Bruce Trail, more commonly up north and down here, but they are. Oyster mushrooms are really common. They tend to flush in July, and I've seen them a lot in the Niagara section. Yeah, boletes are more common up north. I've seen a lot of these in the Sydenham section. And same with birch boletes. They tend to be more associated with birch trees. Yeah, these guys are pretty common. The king bolete, man, they're not common in our area at all, or maybe I'm just not seeing them. Sometimes it's just there's some like I don't know what it is that I'm really good at spotting a lot of mushrooms, but I just walk right by morels. But they are, they're a cool color to be camouflaged as well. Yeah, so I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Thank you. We've got quite a few more questions to go. A question from Bet: Is hen of the woods the same as turkey tail?
No, no, excellent question. So let's see. So hen of the woods um, would be like this, so would be this cluster, and it's just like a huge clump of mushrooms. If I was to pick this, it would probably weigh 20 pounds, and they have a really distinct odor. Um, and you'd almost have to use your imagination that it almost looks like, I don't know, like a rooster exploded or something like that. So I'm just going to go back. Sorry if this makes you guys dizzy. I'm going to go back to my slide of the, actually, I wonder if I can do this. Okay, this is better. Just a minute. I'm going to go back to the slide of the turkey tail. Just bear with me here just to sort of point out the differences. Once I get into here, this is pretty high up. Okay, here we go. So here we have turkey tail. So it has these really colorful bands. So one thing is it's really paper thin, and it tends to be like in layers like this on a log, but almost like in rows. So if I was to draw a log, there'd be like a row like this, and then a row underneath and a row underneath. And they're pure white underneath. And like I said, they're very paper thin, almost not paper thin, but quite thin. A hen of the woods would be thicker. And it has a really unique smell. It's hard to describe, like quite stinky actually.
Okay. We've got a question from Ted. Do all mushrooms that grow on trees cause them to rot?
Gosh, I don't know the answer to that. I think I would say yes. I think that's why they're on the tree. That's their whole reason for being. They may
Okay.
not do it quickly though, right? And some mushrooms that grow on trees are parasitic and will kill the trees. Others wait till the tree is dead and then they grow on it. So one that would kill a tree, and I don't have an example of it here, would be a northern tooth. And it has like teeth-like structures. So from far away, you think you're seeing a polypore, almost like that, but not quite. But then you get close and it's like these teeth. It parasitizes maple trees, and I've touched those teeth and has like a real fishy odor. The other one that kills trees is the honey mushroom. I'm just going to go back to the picture of the honey mushroom. It will kill trees as well. You think I would know this inside out? Anyway,
Okay.
honey
Well,
mushrooms, parasitic.
all right, we've got a comment. Wow, this talk was outstanding and so informative. Thank you for your expertise. So passing that along. I've got a question from Helen. Can you give us some clues as to which ones we should look for in the spring?
Yeah, so in the spring, we're going to look for the pheasant back. I'm going to go back to the polypores. So this one right here is really common in the spring. We're also going to look for that scarlet cup. And in May, we're going to look for morels. So those would be the common ones in the spring.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question from Heather. Can you start mushrooms from a grocery store in the wild at home somehow?
Yeah, so some of them you can, and I'm not really into that. I'm kind of lazy, and this I think why so the reason I forage is one, I don't have to weed. Everything's organic, right? Everything's fresh. And by the way, wild garlic. Let's talk about sort of garlic mustard. Let's talk about garlic mustard, right? Because it's an invasive species. And that is one, Michael, maybe you can comment, but I think that we're allowed to pick on the Bruce trail. Like you want to pick it because we want to eliminate that nasty sucker. So, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. We have like we've got trail captains and land stewards and a whole group of volunteers who get training and are experienced in that. But there's huge work parties and there's volunteers from all over the trail that are pulling garlic mustard like crazy. So I think, if you're not a part of one of our sort of trained volunteer teams, we'd be worried that someone might misidentify and pull the wrong thing. But if you're with one of our volunteer groups and you're, organized by your club or the BDC, then go ahead and pull it. Absolutely. And,
Yeah,
and
and then
make
bring some home and eat it because you can make an amazing pesto. So you take your garlic mustard and some olive oil and some Parmesan cheese and some pine nuts, or you could put in walnuts, make this pesto. And then I really like it on whole wheat pasta. I just find that the whole wheat really marries well with that strong flavor of the garlic mustard. And I'll often dehydrate it and just put it in my, with my spices and herbs. And then if I'm making like spaghetti sauce or something, I put it in. Like it's just crazy delicious. And I've tried to get people who are in the restaurant trade hooked into it, because think about it, like if it got to be popular as something that you put on your menu in a restaurant, you'd have these commercial foragers going out and picking it for profit, and they'd be solving their problem of the invasives, right?
Yeah, that's a good
So
creative thinking.
I got
Absolutely.
off topic. I think I was talking
That's
about morels, and I can't even remember what the question
started
was.
with, well, there is a question on morels. There's a question, how can you tell the difference between a morel and a false morel?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so I'm gonna go back to hang on to that slide over here. Okay, so morels, first of all, are more kind of grain-like, and they're hollow in the middle. So when you cut them in half, they'd be hollow. The stem would be hollow and all the way into this cap, whereas a false morel isn't. And I think I'm just going to say you can Google that and just look for, the term I probably do would put morel, false morel, but look for a picture that shows them cut in half and has them laid open side by side. And then you'll see that's how. But I also think too, like this unique brown color, to me, I don't know. I think these look different, right? You've got this real honeycomb structure here of a real morel. And then you've got this false morel, right? That just kind of looks like, I don't know, a lumpy bumpy brain as compared to this honeycomb.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And I think we'll maybe do two more questions. This one's from Gary Hall, and I think Louise, we're probably not going to give specific locations, but I think Gary's asking in general, and Gary's one of our really talented volunteers as well. If you're not allowed to forage in parks, the Bruce Trail, or private properties, where do you forage?
Yeah, so Crown Land, right? So, and you can go on the web, there's the Ontario Crown Land Atlas, and it has these color-coded maps. So you can forage on Crown Land. So I'll give an example of Crown Land. North of Barrie would be McCrae Lake. But a lot of the Muskokas has Crown Land peppered through, and you are allowed to forage on Crown Land. There's also places, so like there's a little trail near me called Little Tract. It belongs to the Wellington area, like Guelph. It's not a conservation area, so you could forage there legally, right? You could approach a farmer who has a woodlot and ask their permission to forage on their land and maybe buy them a bottle of wine, or maybe they want some of your mushrooms. So I know of certain commercial foragers who are very ethical and sell their mushrooms, and they only forage on private property with permission. So that would be another place, but also like your own property would be a place where you could forage. You know, sometimes you'll find mushrooms in your grass.
Okay, thank you. And then
That's a
I
good
think
question.
the last question for today, when you're picking a mushroom to photograph it, are you disturbing the pore release?
Yeah, no, you're not actually, because by the time, usually most mushrooms, by the time they've opened up, have already dropped their pores. And
Okay.
then what you do is you bring a mesh bag and you put the mushroom in the mesh bag, or you have a wicker basket. And then as you're carrying that through the woods, you know, it's like on the back of your pack, all the spores are coming through the mesh, and you're actually distributing those spores as you go along your walk. So, you know, that's a really good thing to do. So you would never put it in a plastic bag for when it would go really mushy, but you actually want to distribute the spores as you walk. And sometimes if I'm photographing a mushroom and I don't want to take it home and eat it, you know, in an area where I'm allowed to pick. So in Little Track, what I'll do is after I pick it and I look at the underside of the cap is I break it into a whole bunch of pieces, and I throw it all over the place so that I'm just trying to help spread it around. And you want to do that close to the tree you picked it under. So, you know, carrying it and putting it somewhere else, you might accidentally put it in the wrong spot. But if you're sort of breaking it up where you found it and sort of tossing it in other areas under that tree, then you're going to help it propagate.
Okay, fantastic.
Oh, and those
So,
puffballs, right? The ones that you kick.
yep.
Yeah, that's probably helping it too, right? So if you pick them when they're still white in the inside, that's one example where I've always had concerns. Like, remember I said you don't kill the mushroom because it's on a tree. I always worry about puffballs, not the pear-shaped ones because they're just a dime a dozen, but those giant ones, like if I'm somewhere where I'm allowed to forage and there's only one, I won't pick that one because
Okay.
I want it to eventually turn green. You can't eat them when they're green and then explode. So I'll only pick it if there's like three or four. And you don't want to pick them when they're gigantic. They're yucky. They're better when they're like the little like the little, I don't know, baseball size, and they're a little more dense. But yeah, just the puffballs. Leave them alone if there's just one. But go ahead and kick them once they're old.
Yeah,
That's helping them.
that's helping. Well, Louise, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I know everybody learned so much, and you can tell from the questions that everybody's absolutely really engaged. So, reminder to folks that the presentation will be available for those of you that registered for this webinar. And then, of course, we'll have the recording available on the Bruce Trail YouTube page. But Louise, thanks for sharing your knowledge, and thanks for all you do for the Bruce Trail. We're so grateful for everything you do.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. And thank you, Michael.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great long weekend. Take care. Be safe.